crack outsourcing challenges for Daimler and Mercedes and General Motors makes them non-competitive with Tesla is our story for today. This is Greg for Tesla Fan Insight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. I want to especially thank our Patreon supporters. Your support is greatly appreciated. So this week's story sort of comes because there's a battle between my friends at MIT and my friends that are sort of Silicon Valley auto executives. What happened is that I have a good friend of mine who has a PhD. He went to MIT for part of it, but his PhD is actually from Georgia Tech, but I still claim he's a MITFID or a PhD from MIT. So we had a long conversation about where Tesla was going maybe a year and a half ago. And one of the things he pointed out to me is he said, I think Tesla does a great job of vertical integration. As you know, Tesla is running 75 to 85% vertically integrated, where they're building most of their products, motors, batteries, et cetera, in-house. And so what he explained was that, the problem you have is over time, it's hard to stay at the leading edge of each of those fields. So as a result, you end up with potentially huge issues in trying to do so. And so after he said that, I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting, because Bob Lutz at GM had made the comment, well, there's a structure that Tesla has. And for example, in the case of batteries, if Tesla tries to do what it's doing, it ends up with a battery handful around its neck. So in essence, what Mr. Lutz was arguing is that there's an overall structure of how Tesla's operating that might work in the short term, but in the longer term, it kind of doesn't work. So we kind of thought this through, and my thought process was, geez, if it's been Mr. Lutz has been in the auto business for 60 years or more. He knows everything that's going on. So everything that he's describing actually should be how things really work. What's amazing is that as we know, a lot of our viewers have been making the question, how would Bob view what's going on currently with Tesla and the whole auto environment? Because he predicted 3 or 4 years ago Tesla would go out of business. And then he switched his whole perspective to, wow, they understand that you need a certain price point to make enough profit to exist as a company. So as you noticed, the more positive comments he made about Tesla, he was dropped by CNBC because of too many positive comments. So we're now in a very interesting spot where this whole logic of Tesla can't continue as is because of the vertical integration challenges they might incur with it. That's kind of gotten blown up. One, because you're now seeing other automakers start to head towards Tesla's side of thinking about things, and then and doing it and recognizing why they need to do that in order to be competitive. So in essence, Elon is teaching old dogs new tricks about how they need to structure to be competitive in the future of the auto business, which in this case is what Tesla's doing. So our wonderment was, well, how does the large automobile entities compete with Tesla given the future that Tesla is ushering in? And it's kind of interesting because the answer that clearly are showing is that we're modifying how we look relative to Tesla. And I have a friend of mine named Bruce that I went to high school with, and Bruce was in Silicon Valley. He worked with Ford and a few other auto companies in terms of structuring themselves from the future. And one of the stories he told me about was something he calls crack outsourcing. And what he explained is that Microsoft came into Ford, and they were given the charge of taking over the dashboard, particularly on the entertainment console, and they sort of put DOS in there, and the whole thing didn't work. And so this shows one of the challenges of outsourcing. And what he explained to me was that when you outsource, it's kind of like crack, because you get this hit of lower costs because you're outsourcing the cost of doing something within the company. But there's this vicious after headache because if the choices made by, in this case, Microsoft, don't represent where you guys need to go, you're screwed because now you've got a low price, but you got a subpar product because they really didn't have any experience in the field, but they could do things low cost because they're spreading the cost of their development slightly over to this company. So basically there was a wicked back end. And so now, because of what you've lost in that space, you're even more incentivized to do cost control in that space. And now you sort of go through that cycle again. So it's entirely possible that your outsourced entities make optimizations while they're doing that optimization to meet the cost goals that you might have in mind. They're also introducing issues that can create challenges with your customers and other problems that weren't anticipated. So I just thought this whole crack outsourcing idea was fascinating because the vicious hangover is brutal, and how do you sort of manage yourself accordingly? So in essence, the other thing that's happening here, and I mentioned the MIT buddy that I have, is there's a problem happening, which is basically Tesla's outsourcing process should not be working. And the reason is that, for example, Henry Ford ended up going to less vertical integration, et cetera, for the reasons described, which is advances in different zones and how all of that might work. So in the case here, if you think about it, one of the things that we discovered is that when you have 17 moving parts in the engine bay, in theory, the outsourcing process that's mandatory on the combustion engine side of the house, because you have 2,000 parts, is not so mandatory when you have 17 moving parts. And so, in essence, we have a situation where the giant companies are optimized by outsourcing in sort of the old technology world, but it ends up being somewhat of a competitive disadvantage in the new world. So we kind of saw this show up when GM, and we talked about this before, GM got the money from selling Europe, and instead of building a gigafactory, they returned the money to shareholders. What are they doing now? They're doing the same Tesla model of partnering to build a new facility to build batteries heading into their vehicles. So it kind of shows them embracing the logic Tesla is sharing of going vertical integration as a way to control their costs as well as control the optimization of what's happening as those batteries are being built. So this is basically a deal where we look at this and say, it looks like Elon is teaching the auto executives currently what the future is going to look like in terms of the structure of their organizations. And they have a choice, which is to join the parade or get blown out. So we see Daimler's building their own small battery facilities in Chemnitz, Germany. We see the folks, we see the folks building in other places, trying to mirror Tesla's process. One of the challenges we see happening here is just the fact that, you can try to replicate, but you're sort of at the back end of the curve. And as you look at Tesla's vertical integration all the way into power production and sale, it becomes really hard because there are all these sort of expertise areas that are going on. One of the other sort of interesting notes to how all this is working that I found interesting is that I mentor students at Stanford, and one of my students is a software expert, and he was kind of discovered by Google based on his searches and sort of hired by them while he was a student at Stanford. But I was actually kind of stunned because we were talking recently and he explained that they're doing some research work in the labs, and there's an interface between the lab that he's working in and a local company that they're doing work on, which I believe is a Stanford product company. But what you now have happening is sort of leading edge software designers, et cetera, sort of, seamlessly floating between the university environment as top researchers there and heading over. And I think this is a big deal because an example would be something that I've talked about before called SDN, Software Design Networks. So if you think about it, Cisco Corporation was making basically a giant black metal box that was $1 million. That box had code written for it, and it was managing, it's a router, so it's managing information flow, if you will, using all of that hardware technology with software in it. Well, some folks, evidently a Stanford professor, came up with SDN, where in essence, they could use software to manage those networks. And so it didn't matter. You could buy a white box or a very cheap appliance that you could run the software on because all of the management of those networks was being done in the software and the hardware is irrelevant. So now you have units that were $1, $2, $3, $4 million now being all about the software at 50 to 100K. And then you could put a $100,000 or $200,000 cheap white box to go with it. And you get a fraction of the cost of actually messing with what Cisco wants you to spend. And so what we're seeing here is a process where there's a float between the best engineers and software people in and out of the best universities. In case this would be Stanford, but it could be MIT, it could be other places that are research heavy, and the research is floating instantly from the university into the corporations through internships, et cetera. So this kind of explains why it is that Tesla is in a very small, their headquarters is in a 3,000 square foot building kind of next to Stanford University and Stanford Research Park, because you have this weird thing happening where your R&D budget is way bigger than you expected because you have all these people that are floating in and out of their own labs on campus and into your organization. So ideas and the technology future are floating between. So it's our belief that this is part of the reason why Tesla has such great range on their batteries is the computer science department of Stanford is floating into what's going on all over the valley, including into Tesla. And by strategically being this close, all aspects of engineering, be it CS or other departments that Stanford's strong in, get to float into the building without extra cost. So it's interesting to watch how the outsourcing process in a Detroit would mean you're actually getting outside companies, they're doing things for you, and then they go back home and they give you a better cost. In Silicon Valley, the outsourcing might mean there are new fields being developed, and you get to watch those developments from a distance, and then you get to interface with them as they bring you into their organization and start to blend what the research is with what you're doing, and you get something new. And the net cost of doing that is actually really low because you kind of have your own research staff that bleeds into a major university nearby. So the question for a GM, for example, is MIT and Stanford kind of lead this, and how do you find a way to integrate? In the case of GM, they actually do have a research facility, and as do most of the autos that are sitting in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto. But the challenge is that, are they looking, how are they relating to the best and smartest people that are defining what the future looks like? Are they there to sort of test products that folks want to sell to the auto companies, and then they can integrate those products? From what we're seeing, the efficiency of that process isn't happening. I want to say the ultimate efficiency of how Stanford operates is, think about Google. Yahoo was focused on entertainment and other things in which they wanted to grow. The venture capitalists who did Yahoo were like, look, we've got this company, Google, that wants to work on this aspect of what you do. So Google then ends up providing search services to Yahoo and other companies, but you have companies being seeded in-house that end up becoming rather large entities, and everybody makes money in the process. And so it's almost like there's you're getting the best people to be your outsourcers, and they're developing new fields that you could even make money on in the future. So one wonders in the future whether or not large organizations that have big R&D budgets, that have a lot of things happening, don't have to think about, do I just optimize on costs, or do I find a way to have this floating R&D process that Silicon Valley has, where you might actually have companies and products and services being developed in-house that are pushed out of house, and all of a sudden, you now have all the benefits of a bigger budget. One other method has been going on in this regard is looking at what's been going on at Cisco and their process. So what they've been doing is, as engineers have had good ideas, they've spun them off as separate companies, allow them to develop the ideas as working products, and then they will actually have pre-existing agreements to rebuy those companies as they represent legitimate ideas that can move forward. This gets away from the large organization potentially killing things that would end up being huge, and in this case. So what I was hunting for in this show was just the fact that we have a situation right now where many of the biggest companies are behind Tesla in terms of their development. They're now starting to switch what they're doing structurally to embrace what it takes to be successful in this environment. And that includes possibly becoming vertically integrated as a way to identify ways to differentiate products that they're building in the new world of electric. So as this occurs, a lot of companies start to look like Tesla in structure as a way to compete. And again, as we drop down to 17 moving parts inside, with the biggest being the motors, we have the likelihood that firms that had wide-ranging supplier bases end up with smaller supplier bases and building a lot more of their own in-house, because they're optimizations that they can only make if they're building it themselves versus relying on suppliers to make decisions that would be in the best interest of those large organizations. So will this happen before they all go bankrupt? We don't know. In theory, a lot of firms are going to duck out because the competitive pressure of falling costs on the electric side really destroys the integrated structures of the large organizations that don't have the resources to make the change comfortably into the electric world that Tesla's bringing about. So we look forward to your comments on this. I'm kind of disappointed with this whole thing because when you have 17 moving parts and you move everything in-house, there's a whole bunch of jobs tied to these large firms that start to disappear. We're starting to see Daimler and others starting to reduce staff in thousands of jobs as they lose market share in China to Tesla and other places. And I think that this trend is going to continue as they try to figure out a business model that allows them possibly to compete with Tesla. So I want to thank you for taking time out. So I drove Lyft for a while, and I had a situation where, because of the area I focused in, Bethesda, Maryland, I had meetings with about 200 doctors over a year and a half. And what we did with those doctors was I started surveying them on their specialty to give us ideas of health practices they do or they recommend based on specialty. And so at the end of the show each week, I try to add, so I had a top 10 list, and I try to do 5 of that list at the back end of each show. And so some people have asked, why are you doing health tips, et cetera? I guess I was blown away by the fact that these docs charge $1,000 to $2,000 an hour, and they're impossible to get a hold of, even if you could pay, because of their patient load. And so our top 5 list is number 1. A University of Michigan doc suggested to us that 25 leg lifts a day on each leg allows you to strengthen the quad muscles, reducing the chances that you'll have knee issues as you age. A large amount of our demographic are folks that are above 50 that are heading into health challenges over time. The second recommendation that we got was to look at the 5-2 or another diet. Something like 60% of the doctors that we dealt with were experimenting or regularly doing some kind of fasting process. Folks drinking only until 1 or 2 in the afternoon and then eating no later than 7. Another suggestion was eating in a 12-hour band only and not outside that band. So I just wanted to note this was another aspect that was on the high list of what people were doing. Another list was just the 30 SPF or better was recommended by one of the NIH researchers on cancer. Um, uh, Another one that we don't talk about a lot is there was recommended in health that you try to go dancing once or twice a month or play a musical instrument. The goal being neural pathways being maintained in that process. So usually we try to keep it to 5 or lower, but the logic behind it is that we're not claiming to be experts. We're simply talking about what was recommended. The one last one that I wanted to mention today was from a kidney doc that we met, and he talked about the fact that there's a problem with fried foods, which is our bodies have been developing over 2,000 or 3,000 years, and all the stuff that's been developed in the last 50 years, your body kind of doesn't know what to deal with, and one of them is fried foods. So when it comes to substances that the body doesn't understand, instead of digesting it, it will do things like, I don't understand fried foods. Why don't I just store it next to your organs and we'll figure it out at some indefinite point later, which is one of the core elements of type 2 diabetes. So we typically end our show and then bounce into our health tips, which is what I just did. And I wanted to explain the logic of how we got there and the fact that we want to really make our channel not only a Tesla or EV channel, but also a channel where we can all keep learning things that would be helpful in better quality of life. And hence the fact that we included our health tips. And I've tended to be very quick in moving through them and not explaining how we got to what we were presenting. And I will say to you that I actually got an exam from the former head of Georgetown Hospital, and I reviewed my list carefully with him of my top 10 list of recommendations given by docs, and he gave me an A+ on it because all the experts had weighed in. The one other health tip I wanted to mention to you that's a daily practice is the don't go to bed within 4 hours, because that's how long it takes the food to be digested, minimum 2. There's a upper respiratory cancer doc from University of Louisville that said to us, a lot of people are really busy right now, so they're eating and jumping in bed. And what happens is that all of the digested fluids it takes to digest that foods actually rolls up into your upper respiratory and actually causes cancer. So he recommended minimum of 2 hours before going to bed that you eat, preferably 4, because all will have been digested, and now you don't have all of that rolling up to you. He also mentioned that a lot of people think antacids or things of that nature are great ways to deal with this, but what he articulated was that it isn't, because it masks the symptoms. The problem that is created by this is still the same. So it might be something to think about as well. At any rate, want to thank you for joining us. This is Greg for Tesla Fan Insight. Tschüss, German, au revoir, French, lahitro, hiru, choda, hafez, Farsi, heido, zdravstvuyte, assalamu alaikum, ni hao ma, Chinese, and in Jamaica, we say enough respect, walk good. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to our next conversation. I hope you now see why the competitive challenges of others against Tesla is really not good, and suggests that these firms are going to lose a lot of market share and a lot of customers over time. Have a great day, and bye for now.